Hello and welcome to the New York Empire podcast presented by Greatest Ultimate Bag. I'm Jen Hilton, and joining me is not an Empire player, but an AUDL personality, fellow podcast host, and internet analyst. It's Daniel Cohen. Thanks for joining the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited. Just as a fan of the show that's been listening for so long and have my own podcast with the league, it's exciting to have our worlds colliding finally.
Yeah, and I needed to have someone to preview the season before the season began, to have somebody without bias. So somebody who's going to be able to actively or to actually look at not say the issues with the Empire that I don't bring up, but some of the other ways that some of the other teams could definitely challenge the Empire this season, because that's going to be the big question that the Empire, unlikely that any team looking around the league, will get to it, is going to go undefeated this year like the Empire did the last title they won. But before I get into any of that, I want to ask about you, of course, working with Adam Ruffner, as you said, but from your role with the league on the back end. And you mentioned to me before, and it's an incredible thing that I think you talk about on your pod, and I'd love to hear more about at a later date. But the fact that your first introduction to Ultimate at this level was in the AUDL, which again is pretty awesome. So since you joined up with the AUDL, aka the top level of Frisbee, how do you think the league's professionalism has improved since you first joined?
Man, that's a good question, because obviously, I basically started with the league in 2019. I really did not follow professional ultimate at all before that. I was sort of familiar with the fact that it existed, but yeah, most of the evolving of the league I hear about comes from, comparing the 2012, 2013 seasons to like where we are now. I feel like we're kind of currently in, it might just be my mindset of having started in 2019, but like 2019 onward to me feels like the newest era of professionalism and skill level. Like we're seeing offenses year to year just finishing with fewer and fewer turnovers per game. And I just feel like the whole level of play, like it's not the, just throwing things up like Brody Smith and Goose Helton in 2012 and 2013 and just like praying that some guy that is more athletic is going to come down with the disc than the defense. It's a lot more fine-tuned. It feels like strategy is sort of evolving too. You see more teams implementing double team strategies and just like all the roly pulls and different defensive strategies. I feel like in particular where AUDL, I feel like it's set apart from club and college and those other levels in, the field space and the ability of double teams. So it's an exciting time. I mean, I love that I entered the league when I did, and I'm just excited to see where it continues to go.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you mentioned Goose Helton, because I was thinking about that with Joe Smash Anderson coming back to Colorado, being a full 10 years since he played for Connecticut, where just imagine, I mean, that's a brain to pick. Where was the league when you were part of the Connecticut Constitution? Again, no disrespect to them, but then to see where Colorado was already able to enter the league. And yeah, he played for the Connecticut Constitution in their first league, or in their first league season and the first season of the league. So of course there were some growing pains there, but just how far along even a new franchise can be and where they get to start. The starting line has certainly changed. And again, Mr. Anderson has been there for all of it. And again, Goose Helton, I know every one of those, we'll say veterans, has their own individual decision to keep playing, or for both pitchers who retired. And, they all have their own individual journeys. But the fact that Goose Helton still does it tells you that he's still hungry. And there's also new things about the league that keep engaging him and keep him interested and keep him wanting to play and fight for something. And again, there's a reason why Smash Anderson's choosing to return to play and not just a coaching role or some executive role, because he wants to get on the field for this competition. So similar question here. I've been saying this for a bit and getting mixed responses from the Empire players and coaches, because they have their own opinion about talent around the league, or for better or worse, right? Egos exist, certainly, and they should.
Sure,
you're a professional athlete, you don't have an ego. But I'm asking you because I think you're going to humor me, at least as us non-professionals. I think this is the deepest pool of talent the league has ever seen, following it for a number of years now. And that was before the 3 new franchises even joined. All of which, by the way, are markets that consistently produce club nationals level teams, which is, again, I think a good barometer of how talented a region might be, right? So if you can agree with that, up to that point, how do you think the league, though, has attracted that multitude of talent this season? Because it's not like ultimate players in general, I think, yes, they're improving, but as far as just this deep of talent in the league, certainly something has changed a little bit or evolved.
Yeah, I think a lot of it might start with the youth and the lower levels of play, where like, you know, the first time the AUDL was introduced in 2012, you had these guys that were so used to playing in these established club programs, and it was like, oh, like what's this new thing? But I just feel like by nature of having been around for 10 plus years at this point, I do think there's just a big influx of youth talent that we're seeing every single year. And you see it in areas like Carolina and DC, even New York. Like everyone seems to be getting their fair share of young guys that are just like, you know, I don't know, maybe it's a more of a development of high school programs. Maybe it's the high school programs sort of having a focus on AUDL as the end goal. It's been really cool to see. And I just feel like I think the existence of the all rookie teams was something we introduced only in 2019 for the first time ever. And it was like the league is like forcing our hand to come up with these types of awards. Like Rookie of the Year was the first time we named someone just this past year, 2021, Anders Jungst from Carolina. And it was just like, yeah, all these young guys are forcing our hand. They're elevating to the top level very quickly. And I just feel like that has set the league up for a very good trajectory going forward.
Yeah, well, let me push that envelope a little further. I mean, as someone who, again, doesn't have a vote in these kind of things, I do want to kind of push you on that. With Portland, Colorado, and Salt Lake being new franchises, you know, is there anything about how the league will possibly decide an all-rookie team this year? I think it's physically impossible, by the way. Like, it's not your fault. I mean, we were joking about this before we turned the mics on, but for me, Timmy Purston and Rafi Hayes are technically rookies in the AUDL, but I learned the sport 13 years ago watching highlights of that fabled orange beanie of Timmy Purston. And I know I have my beanie timeline wrong or whatever it was, but I mean, Timmy Purston has been around a long time. And to call him a rookie the same way you call some of the teenagers around the East Division we'll talk about, or even the likes of Anders Jungst from last season, to call those guys rookies in the same category, in the same way that while Ben Sadok and Orion Cable were on the same team, well, again, we're going to get to Boston in a minute, to call them the same level of rookie is a bit unfair, I think, to Orion, because Ben Sadok is not truly a rookie. And we know that, right? It's the tongue-in-cheek thing. So I guess what I am, maybe I'm just throwing this out there, that are you considering a possible maybe newcomer award instead of the rookie, and have the Rookie of the Year or all rookie be a U20 type thing, right? Like, I mean, I think like there's just so many new players, especially this season I mean, it may not be a problem with the expansion franchises next year, right? Because it just, the expansion thing throws it out of whack. But yeah, I just feel like we're getting to a point where you're getting this, you know, these new talent or newcomers who are 27 years old and have won club titles and are just incredible players.
Yeah, you're not wrong. We talked about this extensively just with Boston, guys like Ben Sadok and Tanner Halkyard, where they just had these phenomenal seasons. In my mind, it's just like, what do you call that? Like, a rookie to me it's an AUDL rookie, so it's their first year playing in the AUDL. I kind of don't care how old they are. I'm just going to call them a rookie if it is their first year playing in the AUDL. But I get what you're saying. You know, is there a way we can, you know, recognize the younger guys some more and have a separate award or definition of an award for guys that are clearly experienced veterans with the sport? I guess I don't see an easy way to make that distinction. So I feel like with where we're at now, I think we're just going to have to call most of Portland, Salt Lake, and Colorado all rookies. They don't have all rookies. They had, you know, some of them have a fair share of players that have played AUDL before. So
Salt Lake, especially, like some of their better players, Jordan Kerr and Joe Merrill. Yeah, they've been around before. But definitely. Yeah, I understand that. So anyway, if you ever do switch to newcomer and rookie, I do want a piece of the credit. But I also will make sure that if I ever do a Portland game this season, that the minute Rafi Hayes does not outjump 3 other players, I'm going to call it a rookie mistake. Just so we know.
That's perfect. See, it gives broadcasters more of that material to work in. Yeah. So
all right. So we've got 10 minutes in. We had a little bit of fun, but now it's time to be serious in the East Division. And, you know, we've been going through the Empire players, introduced Empire fans to, I'd say, you know, the top 20 to 22, 23 players who they're going to get to know. There are still a few surprises that might play out and earn some playing time. But by and large, we know who's on the Empire this season, looking at that roster. As all those different names are coming in for you, again, I have my own perception of it, but what has been your impression of the coming and goings? Because talking with Anthony Nunez last week and Charlie Hoppes, the goings are important and should not just be, it should be noted that losing guys like Matt Lamar and Josue Aloro, they were around a long time and part of that, that Empire core, if you will. But yeah, what are your impressions of the Empire season or Empire roster this season?
Yeah. I mean, I think the losses, at least at this point, I don't think New York has released their full roster officially yet. So I think to me, the losses are less fresh in my mind. But I have heard the same thing, that like some of those vets that have been around the team for a while will not be returning this year. To me, I think the additions are greater, and I think the additions they've gotten this season are like directly addressing some of their needs. Like, I love the idea of getting a Ethan Fortin, a Charles Weinberg. Like, these are nice depth pieces. And I feel like last year, if you asked me, I would have said like New York was one of the most top heavy teams, where it was like, it could be the Yacht Williams Oscar show any game. And like, that was fine. But at a certain point, you look at teams like DC and Carolina, and it was like, they just have the top to bottom depth that New York never seemed to have. But I think this year, in adding a lot of these more depth pieces that are going to get a good amount of playing time, I think they've addressed the right needs. Things like D-line handler, or I really like the Weinberg signings specifically on offense, because I think it's going to allow Jack Williams a little bit more freedom. I'm sort of buying into the idea that Jack Williams is going to get downfield a little more, where I feel like he is really going to be optimized in his role. And so adding guys like that, where it opens things up a little more. So like, yes, you lose some key defenders, but obviously adding a guy like Antoine Davis too. I don't know why it took me so long to mention him. I'm kind of pushing for him on D-line. I think having another dominant defender alongside Babbitt and Marcus Brownlee, like, that's going to be a huge add for their defense that I feel like would a little too often maybe have to rely on Babbitt to force those turnovers. But also, if you put Antoine on offense, like, no one's going to complain and no one's going to be able to stop him, because you're going to have your fifth best defender guarding one of the best, top 10 players in the US right now. So it's a really great situation for New York to be in coming into the season. I think they've done a great job with roster construction. So also just like returning their coaches, I feel like they do have a lot of roster consistency from last year, both of the coaching staff and, their 20-man roster. So see what happens, but I'm excited to see them in action.
The captain situation and just adding Ryan Holmes to that brain trust. So it's basically the same brain plus Ryan Holmes is a very astute ultimate mind. And yeah, to your point, it was a collection of asking a lot of questions. And I think the Empire have been pretty honest at this point about two of their two main goals in the preseason. Now, the preseason, they've had their own goals, but prior to the preseason, we're talking about roster management and the job of the general manager. And I mean, as we know, throughout the league, it's player on player talent acquisition. That's how things kind of work. But their two main goals were to get Jack farther upfield, have Jack have to handle a little bit less. And you're right, having Charles Weinberg do a very similar thing as what Ryan Osgar did last year for New York is what Charles Weinberg did for Minnesota, where he's initiating cutter, but if you need him to be in the backfield, he has throws and he can take on that role. So whether it's Osgar or it's Weinberg, somebody's going to come in that backfield and you can keep pushing Jack forward, and you don't really have to rely on him to bail your O-line out. And that's one of the things they wanted to do. They wanted to get him farther downfield especially when the points matter in their, those kill moments when you really need to not necessarily universe points, but when you really need to get the goal. And then on the other side of that, the D-line handler core, just having the ability, just adding Scott Shue and Mark Lynn
is another guy.
And Ethan Fortin, you're right. Just all to that, plus whatever Solomon Wertzmeyer Bailey can do in year two. And then the immortal Ben Katz being Ben Katz. So you're right. I mean, there was two things that the Empire were pretty open. I don't know how many teams were this open. They were pretty open about, what we want to do on our roster, how we want to enhance it, what we want to work on. And they address those things. So, from a biased perspective, I'm interested to see exactly how that plan works out, because if they address their needs, then that means that they're going to be even better than the team we saw make championship weekend last week. So the Empire fans, though, they know the Empire pretty well. And you're here, Daniel, to help me with the rest of the division, because as much as I'm so excited about that Empire roster, I do think it is deeper than it was last year. And they did address depth because, again, I mean, covering the Empire, I heard the same complaints that you did around the league, that they're just too top heavy and they don't have that bottom depth where the minute you need to put on D2, then you got a problem. You can't stop Carolina in that championship game, right? But DC, they're going to be the big problem, right? Tyler Monroe, David Cranston, Alan Kolick, Delrico Johnson, Christian Boxley now are pairing up with Reese Bergeron, Rowan McDonald, Zach Norbom, Jacques Nissen, David Bloodgood, Johnny Malks, Jeff Wodach, and Joe Richards. So, I want to create a problem here for them. No, I want to create a problem for them. This is the Empire podcast. Okay. We're going to look at it from the negative perspective of that.
Right. Go ahead.
That Daryl Stanley, who's pretty good at coaching Ultimate as well, will put all those pieces together.
Luckily it's not my job to tell Daryl how to put those pieces together. I think I just trust that he's gonna do it. And when you have that much talent, yes, a huge part of it is how you're gonna use these guys. Are you gonna put Rico on offense or defense when he's been so successful on both historically? Like moving guys around, and I'm most excited to see what approach he takes with the offense, where last year we saw them as this very dynamic, but also very structured handler core and like a lot of possession-based offense, a lot of like small ball. And that was kind of their bread and butter, like take care of the disc, complete short throws and take huck opportunities of Joe Richards if they come. With the personnel they have this year, with Tyler Monroe and Rico and a lot of those other guys, I feel like they're gonna be able to expand more offensively. But my semi-concern is that they were so efficient last year with their approach. So like by switching the approach to maybe a more expansive, maybe a little less possession heavy, maybe they take a few more shots just because of the guys that get out on the field. I feel like Rowan also was sort of playing hurt last year. Maybe his role expands back into MVP form, Rowan. There's definitely question marks as far as like their play style goes. And like I said, I have confidence that Daryl will figure things out. But yeah, I'm most interested to see, what overall offensive approach they take and how much that varies and how much of like a learning curve there is, from the early point of the season to later in the season. Because it might take a while to figure out the optimal rotations. And Adam and I have talked a lot about this with DC. We've talked about it with Minnesota, teams that have gotten these pretty high profile free agent additions, and now it feels like they just have just so many riches on both sides of the disc. Yeah, I think both coaches, with Minnesota, DC, they're gonna figure it out at some point. It's just a matter of when, and I think it will be by the end of the season. So who knows what week 1 looks like. I think New York also is probably going to be doing a decent amount of tinkering with lineups on both sides. Like I don't know where they're going to put Antoine right off the bat. Like I'm sure they're practicing with him on one side, maybe both sides, but it's gonna be a learning experience for both those rosters throughout the season, I think.
Yeah, this will be released before the first game, so still mum's the word from me on that. But how do you stop that handler motion offense is certainly one of the big questions that the Empire are preparing for when it comes to DC. And I find a player like Johnny Malks is the first name on that list that I do circle, regardless of former MVP Rowan McDonald and again Alan Kolick. Charlie Hoppus' his favorite player, and I give one of the best players I've ever seen personally. Delrico Johnson, the guy who I attribute to making wearing gloves cool in the last 10 years, to be honest with you. But yeah, as far as Johnny Malks, first half of last year he was an MVP candidate, and then second half, as players got hurt or came back in the lineup, or, there was a little bit of movement around, and DC kind of, not to say faltered, but they weren't as dominant as they were in the first half of the season. Mm-hmm. And Johnny Malks, that handler motion offense, not even to say that it looked human, but I feel like they did try to get more people involved in the second half of the year, and it was a little less efficient, where, Ultimate gets to this point where you have so many talented players, but at some point, you get more out of an individual, and that can even take your team farther, right? Like it's this weird adage, especially in the AUDL, that if you maximize the best that your 4 or 5 most important players give you, then that might do more than, and this is probably the Empire perspective here, but that can do more than, trying to raise the floor on your 18 through 20, right? Like which one wins you games? Getting more out of 1 through 5 or getting more out of 15 through 20? And so do you want to constantly just say, hey, Johnny Malks, if you're going to be the best player on this team with all these star-studded names, we're going to play with a handler motion offense, heavy on the handlers, and Tyler Monroe, Delrico will wake you up when it's your turn. Joe Richards, right? You know what I mean? Like take a nap for like 15 minutes. Let's work it around. and then you'll get yours. And I think that's going to be a real question as to, how much they want to facilitate that. You're right. Because for better or worse, if they do find that balance, you're right. Like if they do find that balance, then DC, New York is must-see TV. I think it's already must-see TV, but it becomes beyond that. So anything more in DC, or do you want to move on to Boston?
Let's move on to Boston. Yeah, I'm kind of buying into the Boston hype this season. It might be self hype. Like I might be starting the hype and buying into it, but yeah, hit me with a Boston question.
Well, yeah, Boston, it's year 2 for them. I think that my question starts and maybe ends with Tanner Johnson, but there's also Orion Cable in year 2 as well. And the big question for them as a team is, can they improve that defense outside of a full year of Cam Warner? Because I think him available for an entire season is important. And then, I have a follow-up about that, where as far as what they've even added this year, they had their inaugural roster. And now in year 2, Declan Cervic and Benjamin Horsberger named to the USA U20 team, wondering, is it too early for them? And not only is it too early for them, but is it still too early for Boston? Or is year 2 just fine that they figured it out? And I think for that team, watching from afar, availability is really important. If their entire team and roster is there and bought in to playing in the AUDL this season and being healthy and being connected and just saying, hey, we are the Boston Glory and we're going to take charge of the East Division, I agreed. Why not? I mean, DC and New York are the why nots, but as far as every other game on their schedule, why not are they easily the third best team in the division looking at those rosters? I don't know why.
Right. I feel like they are. And like you said, it is a big if, are they going to have all this buy-in from all their players? Are they going to stay healthy throughout their whole roster? But you saw the potential last year, when they played New York and Carolina super close in those games that Tanner Johnson was active late in the season. I think their offense was phenomenal, mostly without Tanner Johnson last year. So when you add a guy with his like MVP level potential, not a ton of teams have like a pure, like if their team goes to the playoffs, for example, like I have no doubt if Tanner Johnson stays healthy the whole year, like he will be a huge reason why. And I feel like he is the type of player that can transform an offense. He's the type of player that can get out there on defense late in the game, similar to how Empire were riding Jack Williams and Ben Yad late in that playoff game against Atlanta. Like I think Boston can do the same thing with Tanner Johnson. Having that upper echelon of talent is just going to be huge. I hope he stays healthy all year. They were the second highest scoring team in the league on a points per game basis last season. So like the fact that their offense can look pretty significantly better, in my opinion, with Tanner Johnson fully healthy, I think that just raises the ceiling that much for Boston. And then their defense, yes, they had a lot of defensive struggles last season. Cam Warner, if they can get him for the full season, obviously that is like going to be their impact defender. Basically their version of a Jeff Babbitt type, where he's just going to be patrolling the entire field at all times, getting those deep blocks, and really making opponents work for the disc. I think Boston's defense is also just gradually going to adjust to AUDL play. Like I mentioned earlier on, I think AUDL defense might be one of the biggest points of difference between the AUDL and club and college play. And so I just think expansion teams might take a little bit more getting used to the defensive side of the AUDL as opposed to offense, where you can kind of just throw out your best 7 offensive players. And if they can throw and catch with, on an entirely huge field, they should be okay. Defense, there's a little more strategizing. And I think Boston, I just expect them almost like a nowhere to go but up situation with their struggles last season. I expect them to be better. So, DC and New York are still at another level than Boston, but Boston is going to challenge them repeatedly whenever those teams match up during the season. I think if they all get to the playoffs, I'm still definitely going to favor New York and DC over Boston, but Boston's going to be punchy and like they're going to cause some chaos in the division is my prediction.
Well, a quick follow-up to that. Ben Sadok was incredible. I mean, I think he was better. I mean, we already joked about the rookie thing. Again, Ben Sadok, not the same rookie as Orion Cable, but, for Ben Sadok, for a guy of his size, and it's been something that we'll say more diminutive players, right, that are basically 5'6" or 5'7" or shorter, they have generally struggled, right, with the exception of like the Ben Katzes and the, you have to help me out. But there are, even Alan Laviolette for Carolina,
Sure.
was out with the ACL. But yeah, like those guys who are a little more diminutive, they do tend to struggle on that wider field that is different than club and college. And defenses are also just easier to shut them down. It's easier to close down that space. Those long, rangy defenders, it's 2 strides from Cam Warner can catch up to a smaller player. So do you think Ben Sadok, I mean, this could go either way, right? Like in year 2, he's either better figured out AUDL defenses and better understands his spacing on the field, or do you think that AUDL defenses are going to get a little more they're going to understand how to shut him down a little bit better on an AUDL size field, right? It really could go either way.
Yeah.
I'm more positive towards Ben Zadok. It's probably
he's
not very smart to root against. I not root, but
yeah, he's so good. I mean, I wrote an article about him earlier this offseason where just looking at the way, because like it is such a thing for handlers to, stay at home in the backfield for a while, but then take opportunities to release downfield and like, try to catch the defense off guard by cutting deep. Ben Sadok scored so many goals and had so many receiving yards, not just because he would release from the backfield so often, but because when he did, there was never a sense of urgency to get back to the handler set. He would just like finish the point as a cutter, like even if the possession took another 20 throws. Like he is so comfortable as a downfield cutter. I feel like he is one of the more versatile handlers in the league. Like there aren't a lot of handlers that can just go downfield and suddenly become your team's top cutter. And I think there was an element of defenses maybe expecting him to come back to the backfield that he probably won't catch as many teams off guard in year 2, where, now when he's downfield, they might respect him and even have a last back defender backing him just because he has that quickness to really, fake in and go deep very easily and within the flow of that offense. It also just excites me more seeing him do that and then watching him play with a guy like Tanner Johnson, where another guy that's so comfortable both in the handler set and downfield. Like if you have those two versatile players just running all over, doing whatever makes sense, like I just don't know how you contain two of those guys, and they're opposite sizes too.
Yeah, well, I think you're onto something. One of the bigger things one of the themes, if you will, that we've been speaking about with a lot of different players, the Empire players in particular, that the more versatile players are at the highest levels, right? Like that's why I continue to make the argument that right now in the sport of ultimate, regardless of divisions, like we're talking club, we're talking AUDL, I think Jack Williams is the most well-rounded ultimate player that exists right now. There is nobody whose second skill is as good as his second skills. Like he does everything at such a high level, even if you don't consider him the best at any one of those things. But he's the best version of an ultimate player as a tandem of different abilities. And you're right, like those players that are so versatile that can cut when you need them to, that can handle when you need them to do, that can, the minute you turn the disc over, they're one of the top 5 defenders on your team. Those kind of superstars are the ones that are going to continue to push this league forward. And I think certainly, as you said about the younger players just getting better and better. And those younger players who, almost like baseball, the younger players that can figure out what those 5 tools are and be really, really terrific and become these 5-tool ultimate players, those are the ones that are going to continue to stand out. And I think Montreal has one, as I pivot to Montreal here. The Montreal Royal, again, will likely be without Quentin Bonneau. And no disrespect to Quentin Bonneau, that's not who I'm talking about, the 5 tools, because when talking about cutting, you only need one tool. If you're Quentin Bonneau and you cut like that, you only really just need the one.
So good.
Kevin Quinlan is back again. So even without Bonneau, potentially, Kevin Quinlan is back again. Christophe Tremblay Jonax is back again, as well as Jakob Brissett, who is obviously who I'm talking about here, who can just do so many different things. I think he's 23 years old or 20 around there. 20,
super young. Yeah.
Can throw with both hands in an incredible way that I also think the league is going. So I assume he didn't get any worse in the offseason, but I do ask questions about this Montreal Royal team, where we saw them in the Canadian Cup. I think they should be, when doing power rankings, above Toronto and Ottawa for their performances at the Canadian Cup. But they are very young. They are kind of new and fresh faced, but they also seem to really have an idea of who they are as far as using the verticality of the field and just, again, using their stars to do their thing, right? Like Tremblay Jonax, go out there, be a sweet defender, and Brissett, go to work, cut, handle, do what you do. But what is the ceiling of this Montreal team, though?
I still just have no idea where to peg them for this season because, the Canada Cup just felt like its own world last season, not just because it was in another country, but just the play style of those teams. I think there was just everyone was on the same page. That was just like, we're going to huck and we're going to huck a ton. And we're just going to kind of see which team has the biggest throwers, most consistent deep cutters. So it was a very specific style of ultimate that I think is pretty heavily contrasted with New York and DC that feel a lot more methodical with their approach. Like, sure, they each of those teams have a good vertical dimension, but it's not like the sole thing they rely on. I was super impressed with Brissett last year. The fact that he's so young and was a rookie, or he wasn't a rookie last year. I think he played like a little bit before with Montreal, but this was his first season in like a featured role in that offense. And like, he just took it and ran with it. I don't know where they keep finding all these ambidextrous throwers too. They had Quentin Roger the season before that was unleashing lefty backhands across the field. I think guys like him and Vincent Lemieux is another guy that they just unlock so much more for that Montreal offense. And I feel like they haven't had a ton of stability year to year. Like, they feel like a team that, I don't know, they're hard to predict every year for me because I feel like their featured offensive players seem to change up a good amount. It does seem like they have a good amount of roster consistency heading into this season than with last season. I just still don't know how they're going to match up with really Boston, New York, and DC. Like, how are those top three teams, going to be overcome by Montreal? And like, maybe Montreal steals a win or steals a couple wins against those teams. Maybe the battle with Boston is particularly close because we saw Boston struggle on defense. But yeah, I'm excited for all the Canadian teams to get back into the US and get back into the East Division. I just have such little idea of where they're going to fit in exactly.
Well, before we do the other Canadian team, let's take a break because I'm kind of am going through the order of how I think it's going to finish in the East Division, and people haven't figured out yet.
You're doing a good job. Yeah,
I do think Philadelphia Phoenix in there next. A lot of young players, though not many vets. I've got Dustin Damiano, Brandon Pastor, Greg Martin, new Phoenix player, but who doesn't know Tyler Girolamo, Matt Esser, Mike Campanella, James Pollard, Alan Michelle, Alex Thorne, Sean Mott, Colin Messino, and Eric Nardelli. So my count might be off because I might have missed somebody, but I've got just 11 players on that roster with 3 or more years of AUDL experience. And, there are questions even about what role will Mike Arcata play this season. And I think there's a lot of this team, not really a question for you, Daniel, but there's a lot on this team riding of the improvement of guys like Mark Sands, Nate Little, Paul Owens. Let me say Nate Little again. Scott Heyman. I'm going to say Nate Little one more time. And returning Bryce Dunn as well. So there are certainly young pieces or younger pieces or newer AUDL players that could take a leap. But I'm not taking anything away from the ceiling of some of those Philadelphia Phoenix stars. But right, Greg Martin, could he possibly give you more? I mean, he's phenomenal. He's one of the top 4 receivers in the entire league. How much more can you ask from Greg Martin? We've seen Sean Mott. I mean, defenses know exactly what he's going to do. They figured out he's lefty at this point. Maybe they have, maybe they haven't. But right, like they know exactly what he's going to be. I think Alex Thorne, his performances in the AUDL have been up or down depending on the season and the fit. And so his role, I think, is always really interesting because of how talented he is. I mean, we know what Alex Thorne is capable of. And then even James Pollard, where his role continues to kind of grow, but what is his ceiling? So with so many different players, did Philadelphia already get as much out of their veterans as they needed to, and they still didn't make the postseason, right? And so does their season, I guess this is my question for you, Daniel, does their season truly come down to what leap can some of their younger players take?
Kinda, yeah. I think that's a cool way of putting it. They're a team that because they have so many young guys and not just so many rookies this year, like you said, guys that have played 3 or fewer years in the league or less than 3 years. It seems like we've sort of been waiting for them to take a leap. And I do think with every year that guys play for the same team with the same guys, developing that chemistry, developing that team culture, I think that just bodes well for guys, specifically at the start of their careers. So, it's another like optimistic year for Phoenix fans, probably. Yeah. Like I would love to see Nate Little sort of take the potential that he showed in a few games last season, just get a little more consistent. I think consistency is sort of their biggest issue. Like we saw them beat Boston last season. That was in Boston, right? Like that was a road game. Not an easy feat talking about Boston as we had before, but Philly, like, you know, they're going to be punchy. I just don't know if they really have the consistency yet to consistently challenge the top of the division. I am excited about their rookies, in particular, Ed Brown, who I've been hearing about.
That was my follow-up. I was going to tell people to get on the hype train.
I've been
getting all aboard. Let's get on the hype train for Ed Brown.
I'm there. I've been hearing about Ed Brown for maybe just like a year now, but probably ever since that pull to lay out Callahan he had in the.
I want to do one of those things, Daniel. I want to either pull that well or lay out. or get a Callahan. Actually,
all three would be all three is
I'd love to do
a dream. Yes. But yeah, so Ed Brown, I'm super excited about watching him play in the Continental Tour. I think he has shown already, you know, not even at the AUDL stage, that he has a ton of potential, and he's still a teenager, I believe. James Pollard is a vet that I still think has one of the highest ceilings on this team. Watching him play offense, and like he got on, I don't know, maybe between just over 50 offensive points or 50 to 100 offensive points last season. Still mostly a D-line guy. You know, he's 6'5", 6'6". He's kind of that classic safety. You know, he's got a huge arm, but I just think his ceiling is really high on offense. And I think a lot of the guys that do take a leap, you know, a little bit into their career or even at the start of their career, oftentimes it is those D-line players that just kind of unlock a new dimension on offense. I think of guys like AJ Merriman last year, where like, yeah, his rookie year, he was a very solid D-liner, but what he did with the disc after turnovers just sort of elevated him to a new status. I think there's a ton of potential for James Pollard to just put him on the O-line and watch him go to work and have another threat besides Sean Mott, besides Greg Martin. Like not every throw has to be a Sean Mott to Greg Martin score. You know, as much as we like to see it, I think Sean Mott can also benefit just from getting downfield a little bit more. We've seen him a little bit sort of by necessity come back to a handler role a lot closer to the disc than he has in years past, where, you know, I think he had at least a 40-40 season or something like that with goals and assists a few years back. But, you know, it's a lot more handler heavy for Mott. And I think, you know, similar to Jack Williams, as we talked about, those guys are optimized when they're getting downfield a little bit more. So yeah, just a little more firepower, a little more consistency on offense, I think would go a long way for this team.
Yeah. I mean, the same argument in Pittsburgh. I know it's not in division, but Max Shepard, the same thing, where like, what can you do with him? So many different things. And yeah, again, you took my follow-up, so I'm just going to throw in that, yeah, unlike the two U20 USA team players for Boston that I mentioned, I think both Adam Grossberg and Ed Brown have a chance to have big roles for Phoenix this year, as well as another under 20 player in Casey Thornton, who I thought looked really good in what the 2 or 3 games that he featured for. And I think he was 18 last season. So, you know, especially Thornton and Brown, I think they're going to be expected. Thornton on the O-line, Brown likely on the D-line, whether it's D1 or just featuring as one of the top 10 or 11 defenders, right? Yeah, I mean, Phoenix, you know, these youth movements, they make sense when you have really good young players who do take gigantic steps. And I think Phoenix could be an example of a team that from week 1 to the final week of the season looked very different because of improvements made throughout the lineup. And hopefully, again, that's a team that they've been building for a long time. I mean, Philly Ultimate has a good history of producing a lot of good players. And along their club lines or along the club scene, it's always just broken off in a lot of different places. So you've never truly, I think, seen this total collection, like we're seeing in the DC Breeze, this total collection of Philly talent. And I think, you know, even though you still don't have that here, this Philly program, if they really can say, hey, this is what our rebuild not really looks like, but we have these veterans and we have a young group. And if this can be year 1 for these young group, let's see what they can do in year 2 next season, right? And they make like next season becomes the goal, right? And I think of like NBA teams like Minnesota Timberwolves finally, right, getting over that hump, like that kind of thing, where it's like, you know, we've unfortunately not been able to make the playoffs, but you know, this rebuilding, you know, we can throw out all of that was. this is going to be the thing that is going to push us forward because this young core is going to take a step forward. Now, speaking of rebuilding, right? Rebuilding, if you want to say that in the East Division, you have to start and end with the Toronto Rush, right? Because no team was as high as they've always been. Of course, that franchise is one that I think those who've been around the Empire for many years still wake up in cold sweat. Like, I know Toronto is no more, and the Empire got over the championship hump, but still, the Toronto Rush is a thing of nightmares from the past. But, Luke Meyer, Phil Turner, Kevin Jay, Wilkie Lewis, some returning faces. But this roster looks like year 2 of year 1 of the franchise's first rebuild, to be honest with you. I mean, just looking at how many other new rookies, right? Last year in the Canadian Cup, they had a ton of new players, and now they've reset with an entirely new bunch of new players as well. So, what are your expectations for some of the second-year players, like a Daniel Wong or an Eli Park? Or, you and I were talking about this beforehand. Like, I had to Google, and I'm trying to figure out what Grand Trunk Ultimate is because of all the new faces that Toronto has brought in from these local programs. And I think it is a bit unfair for me, and I guess you as well, to be talking about Toronto because, I'm just not as familiar because the border's been shut down. Not that I go and scout in Toronto, but with what's happening in Ultimate in Canada is a bit foreign to me as opposed to my understanding of local Philly Ultimate or Boston Ultimate. But yeah, so Toronto, how much into this rebuild do you think they truly want to be? And, what does a new franchise for them look like?
Yeah, I think I'm excited about the fact that it seems, at least for this year, that they do have this apparent pipeline of a team going towards, sort of evolving this rebuild with the Rush. I, like you, I really don't know many, like this might be the one roster in the league that I know the fewest players on, which is weird when it goes from, like Ottawa and Toronto, just, Ottawa was always the team that I was like, I know a few of their top players, but not really anyone else. It's a sign of the times when you know way more players on Ottawa than you do Toronto. And it's a changing of the guard, right? And I think you just expect to see some more development, more potential sort of evolving throughout the season. I don't think anyone has them in the playoffs for the East Division this year. And it might be a multiple year. It should be a multiple year rebuild, I would expect. But I think if I were a Rush fan, like I would be excited about the potential of these new guys, a lot of whom seem to have played together before. And just like becoming the underdog again. I think there's going to be a sense of like, chip on your shoulder, like, let's see what we can do against these top teams in New York and DC. And who knows, maybe there are a few trap games that come Toronto's way when they're playing at home. Like, I think they still have a great home environment. I think traveling up to Canada is never easy. So I won't rule them out of the East Division quite yet, but I would be pretty surprised if they can consistently compete with those top teams.
Yeah, I think Toronto as a franchise deserves a few years of they know what they're doing, if that makes sense, right? Like they have bought themselves to success, to long tenured success. I know Mark Lloyd and Cam Harris, like they're not going to walk through that door, right? And in this case, it'd be snake in the grass, right? Like Mark Lloyd's not snaking in the grass, right? To get a D, but this franchise certainly was able to quote unquote soft rebuild a few different times. And even though the names have changed, the faces have changed, and things have gotten a lot younger, yeah, for certain. If they're still rebuilding, if you will, or in a reset every year and bringing in 14 or 17 new players 4 years from now, then of course things have changed. But I think definitely they've deserved at least one season of back in the U.S., facing off against the U.S. teams to just understand what they're trying to rebuild. Then we'll see where they are next year or the year after. Again, not for sure qualifying them from the postseason, but with what we know, New York and DC and even Boston are bringing in this year, it's going to be an uphill climb for Toronto to get back to that glory. And speaking of uphill climb, for the Ottawa Outlaws, still looking for their first playoff appearance in franchise history. They have vets like Jeremy Hill, Carson Turner, Andy Octorloni, Greg Ellis, David Kolek, Matt O'Brien, Paul Renault, Jeff Bavon, and of course, Alec Arsenal. Cannot make a list without him. Plus, rising stars like Brandon Adibe, Reese Toogood, back for year 2 for them. So with all those names, it does feel weird to project them to finish last in the division. And as I'm saying it out loud, I think I might move them above Toronto. But again, Toronto's Toronto, so we feel so weird putting them last in a power rankings. But I think
Yeah.
Ottawa just has they have more top level talent and veterans who know this league well and know how to navigate playing in the US, even know how to, they know what to eat on a trip to Philly, right? Wawa, of course, the answer. But they know what to do when they're on these road trips in the US in ways that maybe Toronto may not. So maybe I'm being a little unfair to Ottawa here.
Yeah, I agree with you. It would feel weird to put Toronto last because Toronto still kind of has this like, leftover winning aura about them. Meanwhile, Ottawa has really never felt that way, but they did kind of start to flip the script last season, like very similar to how Austin and Dallas all of a sudden became this like pretty heated rivalry. Historically, like Toronto's just always dominated Ottawa. I mean, sure, they've had some close games over the years, but Ottawa coming out first weekend of the Canada Cup last year, taking down Toronto and Montreal in back-to-back games.
I didn't say his name. Say his name, Nick Boucher. I don't know how I.
Oh, Nick Boucher. Yeah,
it's on my list that I missed his name. So yeah, I mean, he played games last year. If he plays more than games,
he got hurt.
Yeah, maybe Ottawa wins the Canada Cup.
Yeah, I mean, he had more total yards in a single game than any other player in the league last season. So, I think Ottawa is going to be limited by, again, just like that Canadian, fast-paced, huck-heavy play style can either be great or be not so great if those deep shots are not connecting. So similar to Montreal, I'm just excited to like see how Ottawa comes back to the US play and adapts, because Nick Boucher, I mean, he was just like a pure shooter in that game specifically. I think he tossed 11 assists or something like that. And guys like Arsenault getting downfield for him very consistently. They got a lot of guys that can run, and they have a few handlers that can put the disc deep very consistently. Again, it's just like that adjustment to a different level of play that I think we saw and we've seen from the East Division. And it, felt like a different world in Canada. So I don't know. I guess if you ask me right now, I might put Ottawa over Toronto. Like, does Toronto have anyone on the roster that's played more than like 2-3 seasons in the league? I feel like they probably don't.
I think it's just the four I named. I think it's just Wilkie Lewis, Kevin Jay, Phil Turner, and Luke Comeyer. I think that's it.
Okay, but maybe they've played like
2 or 3 seasons.
Yeah, like a few seasons, right?
Yeah, I mean,
so yeah, I think I lean a bit
older than most of Toronto's roster.
Right.
I mean, he can still do it. That's what I'm saying. Like,
I think I lean a bit more towards the experience of Ottawa for whatever it's worth. And they did just bring in an entirely new coaching staff this season. Historically, I think they've had like a couple coaches throughout their franchise history. They don't always have a coach coming into the season. So the fact that they've gathered this 3-person sort of homegrown Ottawa coaching core, I think that just bodes well for the overall culture of the team. And I would be hopeful if I were an Outlaws fan for sure.
All right, so that's the East Division. We've done it in pains. And whoever's still with us, we have a special surprise because the final is us talking about, the big picture stuff, but we went all the way through the East Division. So knocked out of the park, Daniel. So as far as contenders, though, I think we're going to be safe here. We know that it's New York and DC from the East, putting a little asterisk there next to Boston. And then we have Carolina and Atlanta, San Diego, Minnesota, maybe Chicago, maybe Colorado or Portland. Who knows? Maybe a surprise or 2 as well. But would it surprise you if there are 4 new teams at championship weekend this year, or at least 3?
Four new teams.
I don't want to get you in trouble with the Empire podcast, because again, those who are still here with us are pretty devout Empire listeners. So even 3 new teams, right? Of the 4, we'll say. So
I'm thinking if there were 4 new teams, I would say it would have to be DC, Atlanta, Minnesota, and Colorado probably. And I think that is reasonably realistic. Like, DC and Atlanta are really not far behind the presumed favorites in each of their divisions. I think there's a lot of similarities between the East and the South in that way, where they have like, the 2 teams that were in the championship game last season, then a second team that's right on their heels, and then a couple other teams sort of waiting in the wings. It would not surprise me if there were 4 new teams. I'm not going to predict there will be 4 new teams. I want to pencil in New York. I still think I lean towards the historic postseason success they've had, especially in recent seasons, and the fact with DC that we just like haven't really seen it from them. I was like pretty sure they would. I had them beating the Flyers in that playoff game last season. They looked great in that first half. I think they had something like a 12-8 lead at some point, but Carolina just did the thing they were doing all season where they just never quit. They never went away, never rolled over. And I think that sort of mentality and culture that Carolina has makes me feel like Carolina will probably be in it again. Because Atlanta, similarly to DC, while they were in great position to win that game against New York last season in the playoffs, they just haven't really shown the ability to close out games when they really matter. So I tend to favor those more experienced teams that we've seen from them now for at least a season or two, and trust them in those clutch situations. So yeah, I'll just continue with my final 4 here. Right now I'm taking New York, Carolina. I am going to take Minnesota getting to their first championship weekend, which would be the fourth different Central Division champion in the last 4 seasons. Which is cool. Central Division's a lot of fun. I think Indy is also
division. Yeah, look at that division. That is a deep and tough division. Yep.
It is. And I think Indy is going to be a lot punchier this year than they were last year. I think adding guys like Keegan North and having Cam Brock for a full season, like that's just going to help everyone on that offense a lot more. Madison's not going anywhere. Chicago's not going anywhere despite some of their losses, but I do just feel like on paper, Minnesota has the most talented team. And the fact that I was at that game against Chicago, that playoff game in Chicago where Minnesota just easily looked like the better team for a full 3.5 quarters of that game. And you just saw them starting to crumble down the stretch. I kind of feel like it was unlucky and not likely to repeat itself. And the fact that they went down to Chicago, a road playoff game, and just really outplayed Chicago. It gives me more faith in them as a franchise, especially because they've added.
Yeah, I was going to say, even players they added. Abe Coffin.
Abe Coffin is going to help that lineup a ton. Yeah. And they lost Charles Weinberg, of course, but I think Abe Coffin is probably a slight upgrade in the middle of the field, I would assume. So, yeah, I'm going to pencil in Minnesota, and I am going to say San Diego holds on to that West Division championship weekend spot. It's hard to just come in here and pick an expansion team to take down San Diego. And San Diego has been the consistent team out West the past 2 seasons, having gone 10-2, both of the past 2 regular seasons. They've taken care of business in their playoff games. Yeah, championship weekend, they still don't look like they're quite at the level of a New York or Carolina, but they did outplay New York in the second half of that game. I think they played Dallas really close in that 2019 semifinal game. So San Diego, I think they're like the most veteran team in that division. They have probably the most talent on paper. They've added all these aviators, guys like Chris Mazer, Sean McDougal. They seem to bulk up their roster every single season. So obviously they have a target on their backs at this point. And I think any of those expansion teams are going to like really look forward to those matchups with San Diego and potentially upsetting them. But yeah, when it comes down to a playoff game, I am going to trust San Diego to take care of business. So to recap, New York, Carolina, Minnesota, San Diego. It's kind of boring. I guess I only picked one newcomer from last year.
Well, my only notes for you is former Empire player Chris Mazer. Of course, we talked about the Central Division, and shouts to Johnny Bansfield and Joe Corbett. A number of different guys are going to stand up for Detroit this year. They're getting that victory.
Please do.
We're all saying it. So we kind of will it into to happening. And yeah, I think not say the big 4 from the East and the South, again, no stick to Austin or Dallas. They're a franchise with a lot of good players. But I mean, for what Carolina, I think them even a championship team is scratching the surface of what they can do with that handler offense. And we talked about DC as well, but Carolina's is not say even a souped up version, but the experiences that Mac Johannes and Saul Yannick have already had, and that Johnny Maltz is kind of gaining, right? That we're just talking almost an upgraded version. And it is interesting, Carolina and DC looking in the mirror that way. And then, of course, I was at that playoff game as well, Atlanta and New York. That really is looking in the mirror between those two teams. And so it's interesting to me that it's basically two different styles going to deciding both divisions, right? In theory, the South could be decided by a lot of handler heavy motion and against a team that is willing to use verticality, that is going to use a lot of different defensive zones and a lot of different looks to you on defense. Of course, Miranda Knowles, we know what she's capable of. And then for New York, DC, a very similar thing, where is DC going to go handler offense heavy again? And for New York, just how are they going to beat you? Not only through the air, but up through the middle and with all their different weapons using the verticality of the field. So it is interesting that it's not just coming down to New York, Atlanta again, or DC, Carolina again, because I don't know. I don't know if I like the two contrasting styles, if that proves anything about the game, or if I would prefer them to play, you know what I mean? Like, would you rather play the one that looks like you, or would you rather play the opposite?
Right. Yeah. It's hard to know. I guess New York got to play both, right? Yeah. And they, took care of business against Atlanta, and Carolina just, only had 7 turnovers in that championship game. And I think that's why, why I thought of DC as such a dominant and consistent threat last season, was because when you see them at their peak, when they're limiting turnovers to that extent, like, that is kind of still the name of the game, even if, you have teams like New York and Atlanta that have great vertical games and have guys that can beat you, in a bunch of different ways. Not turning the disc over just gives you that extra edge, and it's a more boring version of Ultimate, but seems to have gotten the job done a good amount, which is, it brings me back to I don't know if DC necessarily tries to get away from that so much this year. I feel like they should, again, based on their personnel and the guys they've added, but it was their best offensive season in franchise history. So it's like, how do you rationalize that?
Right, for sure. So, of course, New York against DC Breeze for you Empire fans, Saturday, April 30th. We will not have that broadcast, so you're not going to be able to hear me for that one, but I'll be watching along with you on AUDL.tv. That is a 7 p.m. start in DC at Carlini Field Catholic University down in DC. And then the first Empire home game is going to be Joseph F. Facina Field, 7 p.m. Saturday, May 7th against the Philadelphia Phoenix. But before that even, I'll have my eyes glued to that New York DC game, of course. And I'm also going to have my eyes, of course, glued to the San Diego against Portland and San Diego against Colorado matchups. I think, again, those are, no offense. I mean, yes, of course, there's Minnesota and Chicago, some of those other ones. Madison will be in there. I'll tune in on AUDL TV for all of it, but I'm really interested to see how those expansion teams do stack up against the San Diego Growlers this season. But Daniel Cohen, fantastic. I mean, you do so many things, so I know we've almost run out of time, but where can people find everything that you do? Because as much as you were fun on this podcast, I would shoot people right to Cohen's Cuts, because I think a lot of people talk about, the vibes, and everybody feels like their opinions of players are subjective. But if I watch Cohen's Cuts and listen to you guys on your podcast with Adam Ruffner, I feel like it's objective. So I can objectively speak about which players and how they rank, and everything does make a little more sense. So where can people find you?
Thank you. People can find me on Twitter at It's Daniel Cohen, ITS Daniel Cohen. And then, Cohen's Cuts are on YouTube. If you just search Cohen's Cuts AUDL, you will find all those videos. And then, like Dan mentioned, Adam and I have a podcast called Swing Pass. We've released new episodes every Wednesday, but we're actually transitioning more to our in-season schedule. We're going to start doing 2 a week, probably a Tuesday episode and a Thursday episode. So once we're in season, we'll sort of get in the rhythm of previewing the upcoming weekend's games on Thursdays and then recapping those same games on Tuesdays. So check us out on Swing Pass.
So of course.
Oh, also AUDL Weekly, every week on Wednesday. Me, Adam, and Evan Lepler get into all sorts of fun debates. So I do so many things I forget about several of them often. So
so we do have a little bit of fun content for the Empire fans as well coming down the pike as the season is about to get underway. So I hope you've enjoyed all the preseason, getting to know the players, and I hope you enjoyed this one with Daniel Cohen, the league helping us out here to preview the rest of the East Division. But thanks so much to Daniel for joining me today, and thanks to you, the listeners. This wraps up another edition of the New York Empire podcast. For the entire New York Empire family, we'll talk to you soon.